topics, particularly rooted in the roles that you play in your communities as organizers, as volunteers, as underpaid nonprofit educators, all of the things. And I'm going to be, yes.
Oh, sorry, Courtney, I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to let people know who you are. So do you mind if I share some background information from your bio so they know who you are and what you're bringing to the table today?
Please, I jumped right in there, but please.
Oh, no, that's okay. See, everybody's excited. This is great. So our keynote speaker today is Courtney Parker West. She is a former public school teacher and a teacher coach, a community organizer, a writer, and a consultant. She lives and works in rural Eastern North Carolina, and she has spent her career in public education and
At the tone, please record your message. When you've finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
I don't know what that was. It's okay. And Courtney is currently serving as the National Managing Director of Leadership Development and Capacity Building at Teach for America. So Courtney believes in the power of intersectional, anti-racist, institutional, and community organizing efforts. She endeavors to operate from her core values of storytelling, bridge building, individual and communal healing, and collective liberation. Today, her presentation is titled Deconstructing Bias with an Intersectional Lens. So welcome, Courtney, and I won't interrupt you again unless you ask me to. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not sure what that was, but I have a feeling that I was responsible for it. So thank you all for your patience with all of my tech expertise. Again, my name is Courtney Parker West. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm thrilled to be here this morning. I'm calling in from Zebulon, North Carolina, which is roughly halfway between Raleigh and Rocky Mount. Mr. Irvin, I do spend some time in Rocky Mount, and I love it there. Your hometown has a lot of personal and professional meaning for me as well. And I am calling in on the unceded land of the Catawba people. So as someone who myself is Indigenous, I think it's really important that we not only acknowledge the land that we are on and the history and context of that land, but I also think it's important that we don't allow things like land acknowledgements to replace the important work that we do with First Nations peoples around getting the government to honor our treaties and to work more closely with the needs of Native communities. So thank you all for having me here, and I'm really excited to jump into some conversation. But before I do, I wanted to share a little bit about who I am. And so I'm going to go ahead and try my hand at sharing my screen. We'll see what pops up. Looks like the right thing. All right. I'm also pretty sure I was supposed to use a particular PowerPoint. I did not. Apologies for that if I was sent a template. But I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about these important concepts and the language of these concepts, what it means to deconstruct something, what bias is, and what intersectionality is, because there are a lot of buzzwords that have emerged in the past couple of years, especially pertaining to equity, that I think are important to name and get into, even as we have conversations around, so how do we move from an understanding of what these concepts are to how we enact them in our daily practices. So a little bit about me, as was already named, my core values are storytelling, bridge building, individual and communal healing, which I believe is inherently intergenerational, and collective liberation, because I truly believe that unless every single person is fully free, is fully able to actualize their self-determined future and opportunity in an equitable way, then truly none of us are free. And if we are looking for a liberated society, and I would argue that not everyone is interested in creating that liberated society, but if we are, then we have to hold the tensions of what it means to be in profound disagreement, diversity, engagement, and see the full humanity of every person doing critical work together. And so I come from a very large interfaith, multiracial, multi-ethnic family. I have many siblings, many nibblings. One of my most critical roles is that of auntie. I have been auntie like a boss for over 20 years, and my siblings' children are always kids that I hold near and dear to my heart as I'm thinking about my work as an educator, as an organizer, and as someone who works to create a fundamentally different future for the world that they'll inherit. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the Meskwaki Sauk Federation, and I identify as a womanist. I think it's really critical in everything that I do, that I'm thinking about all of the intersecting aspects of who I am and where I come from. I'm also a very proud graduate of the University of Iowa. I'm a first-generation college student, and as someone who graduated with some interesting creative writing, religion studies, English. I had a minor in African American studies, graduating college in 2008, which was such a great time to graduate college. I was thrilled to be able to move into my work in the classroom in rural Eastern North Carolina by way of Teach for America, work with my students as their teacher. I taught middle school language arts, and then ultimately moved into a coaching role. So I got to be in that community for 8 years, and have continued to do work throughout Eastern North Carolina through Teach for America and other organizations that I'm part of. And so, things to know about me are that I believe in organizing people, ideas, and communities toward outcomes that are truly going to enhance the best possible outcomes for everyone. I also am married to a wonderful school leader here in North Carolina. He is a traditionally trained public educator, and is an assistant principal in our state, and works tirelessly and incredibly hard with students. So I feel like even though I'm no longer in the classroom, I certainly have a lot of proximity by way of his work. Okay, so let's get into intersectionality as a concept. As Sister Audre Lorde said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And I think that's one of the first barriers to understanding intersectionality, which is that it's not about ranking humanity. It's not about saying, well, this piece of my identity is more salient or more relevant than another piece. I'm a Black and Native, Jewish, queer, woman of color. All of these pieces of who I am are interwoven into my full humanity. They make up the tapestry of the sacrifice of my ancestors. And so I don't have the privilege or the liberty of walking into a space and leaving these things at the door, because they are what make me who I am. And they also drive my vision of what could be possible for this country, which is the land of my ancestors on one side of my family, and it's a land that was cultivated by the exploited labor of the other side of my family as kidnapped and enslaved Africans, including here in the state of North Carolina, a state that I love and that I call home and have called home for almost 15 years now. And so it's important that even as we have the issues and values that really command our attention and that drive us to volunteer, to organize, to engage, to educate, we have to be willing to ground ourselves in the realities that we are so much more than any one aspect of our identity. And understanding intersectionality is more than just intersecting identities. And I think that's one of the most common misconceptions around intersectionality. So I want to take just a couple minutes and ground us in a shared definition, so that as we move through this conversation, that can be something that we're on the same page about. So first and foremost, this is a great quote from Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who is a critical race theorist and educator, a Black feminist, who is considered to be the mother, if not one of the mothers, of intersectionality, of the concept and study of it. And I always like to include a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, because her work was rooted in the intersecting identity specifically of Black women, because she is a Black woman. And it's important, again, to acknowledge that if we aren't intersectional, some of us, those of us who hold multiple intersecting marginalized identities, we are the most vulnerable and are going to fall through the cracks. And I want to cue in on this word vulnerable, because it's important to acknowledge that we're not just happenstance vulnerable, right? It's because throughout history, certain groups have been targeted, exploited, oppressed, excluded. And therefore, in our contemporary day-to-day life, those communities, those individuals are vulnerable to a system that was not only made for not their inclusion, but was made for their explicit exploitation and exclusion. So this is the context in which we are seeking to do really hard, really heart-oriented work, right? So a lot of people get involved in education, community organizing, politics, volunteerism because they deeply, deeply value through their own moral or philosophical orientation, their identity, other things that have influenced who they are as a person. They get involved in this work because we care, because we want to change the world. We want to make the world a better place. And many of us would come into these spaces, I know I did as a first-year teacher, thinking, I'm here for this community because I stand with this community. And a lot of us immediately begin our work by putting some distance between us and them. And oh, how charitable that is. But the reality is that charity is an ineffective and insufficient response to systemic injustice. And so we can't be wearing our charity hats. We have to be wearing our liberation hats. The hat that says, like Lilla Watson, an Indigenous leader of New Zealand, said, if you are here because you want to help me, fix me, save me, you're wasting your time. If you're here because your liberation is bound with my liberation, let us work together. And so when we think about why we're showing up to spaces, we also have to consider who we're showing up as, the power and privilege we bring into spaces with us, and our motivations for coming to spaces where we are working with other human beings, some of whom have been historically, systemically targeted, and therefore are vulnerable to the systems that we're operating in. And so I wanted to name that because it's a really important grounding piece of how I enter spaces. And I think it will help us to orient a little bit more to the language of, so what is intersectionality? So I'm going to acknowledge that there's a lot of text on the next slide that you're going to see. And so I am going to give everyone just a few moments to internalize it in just a moment. And then I will give voiceover for those who might be listening, may not be able to see what's on the screen, and might have some challenges reading due to the amount of text. I'm going to give folks just a moment to internalize this definition before I read it aloud. I'm going to give some voice to this definition of intersectionality, because there's already some really controversial language, right, that you might have noticed, because there's a lot of conversation right now around concepts like critical race theory. So first and foremost, intersectionality is a concept first advanced by Black feminist critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. We saw her on the previous slide. And now it's often used in critical theory as intersectionality argues that classifications such as the social groups to which we belong, gender, ethnicity, race, class, sexual orientation, and others cannot be examined in isolation from one another because they interact and intersect in individuals' lives and society, in social systems, and are mutually constitutive. So what does that mean? Because I said there's a difference between intersecting identity markers and intersectionality. And yet we see these words interact and intersect. So let's take a look at that last line. Lives, it's individuals' lives in society. So now we're talking about a social arrangement of power, of institutions, of history, of environment, and social systems. That's how those institutions interact with each other and are mutually constitutive. They're supporting each other, they're in tension with each other. It's important to remember that intersectionality describes the ways in which oppressive systems, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from each other, and also applies how individuals live within these interconnected systems and therefore can experience multiple forms of oppression simultaneously, okay? They can experience also privilege alongside oppression, which is something that we have to remember, that when we are talking about oppression, if we center only the oppression, something becomes invisible to us. What's invisible? The advantage. Because when one group is being oppressed, it's usually not because that group has been selected for oppression. It's because there has been another group selected for advantage, and the byproduct of advantaging one group, particularly at the expense of another, such as through kidnapped and enslaved labor, such as forced relocation and genocide of First Nations peoples, such as exploiting immigrant labor, such as excluding marginalized peoples, be they in the LGBTQ community or other communities legally from being in spaces, women from being in spaces. All of these things together are advantaging different groups. And as some groups start to, over time, particularly in US history, as some groups become more advantaged, they get closer to power, they get closer to access and inclusion, And they might start to buy in politically and otherwise to those privileged identities that get them things, even as they still hold marginalized identities that they could be choosing to put them in league with those who have not yet obtained the level of access and opportunity that they themselves have achieved. So it's important when talking about intersectionality to remember that we're talking about multiple systemic power dynamics that are showing up in individuals because of the systems that they're forced to navigate. Systems that do not value all people equally, because if they did, we would not be seeing some of the things that we're seeing along the lines of oppression. So where does all of this fit into the work that we're doing together as volunteers, as organizers, as educators? Well, as we offer our services, we're running up against a lot of isms, right? Ableism, sexism, racism, colonialism. And if we're not reconciling with these concepts, classism, heterosexism, if we're not engaging with them for our own growth and development, then we are going to be perpetuating them in the systems in which we are doing the work that we're doing. And it's important to remember that, because systems are set up to be self-functioning. They exist both because individuals perpetuate them, and it's not the individual person that matters as much as the impact of the broader system on whole communities. So there will always be examples of people who say, well, I hold these identities and I've experienced success in this country. There will always be people who say, well, I hold all of these identities that should have put me at the very top of, this hierarchy of power and privilege and opportunity, and yet I'm struggling, and yet I'm not having my basic needs met. And so it's important to acknowledge that on both ends, on all ends of the many spectrum, that people are having different experiences, and we have to zoom out just from individuals and look at whole communities. What are the trends we're seeing across whole communities? And how are we ensuring that we don't pathologize those communities by saying, oh, this community needs X, Y, and Z, without examining why that might be, and therefore what our role in helping to connect people to resources, to opportunities, to institutional access, whether we're doing that in a volunteer role, whether we're doing that in a paid role, whether we're doing that on behalf of a government or nonprofit, or in the education, the public school system. We have to be thinking about what is our role in understanding how we are showing up as gatekeepers in institutions, as power brokers in institutions, and how can we, because gatekeepers, by the way, is not a dirty word. Gatekeeping has been abused, but we can also use our power to open doors and to hold them open. Because often there's nothing deficient or wrong with marginalized peoples and communities. It's that there's barrier after barrier after barrier after barrier that folks need support in removing, because we've inherited a lot of these barriers. We did not ask for them. And those who have inherited barriers in such a way that privileges them typically didn't ask for the privilege. So we need to depersonalize how it feels to be in tension with, oh, I'm uncomfortable that I have this privilege, or, oh, I am overwhelmed by the amount of opportunities I have, knowing that there are people I care for that don't have those opportunities. We need to move past that so that we can actually be in true relationship and acknowledge that there might be some trust factors, some issues that inhibit people from wanting to work across meaningful lines of difference when we're contending with all of these isms. And this image on the slide, that's just a few. So why do we want to think about deconstructing bias with that intersectional lens? So we talked a little bit about intersectionality, so we'll come back to that. Let's talk about what it means to deconstruct, okay? So I was just curious, what's the definition of deconstruction? I actually looked it up in the first couple of moments, so it's not on the screen, but I am gonna drop it in the chat, okay? I just dropped it in the chat for those who either can't see the chat or for whatever reason aren't able to read it. I'll elevate the definition. To deconstruct is to analyze a text or a linguistic or conceptual system. We're going to go with conceptual system for our purposes, typically in order to expose its hidden internal assumptions and contradictions and subvert its apparent significance or unity. I was fascinated by that because I hadn't thought about deconstructing an idea quite in that way, but it makes sense, right? Because we hear a lot about bias, right? Implicit bias. It's become a little bit more popular to take some of the implicit bias trainings. We've got anti-bias curriculum through a lot of really great organizations that are doing dope work. And yet, I don't think people fully appreciate or understand what bias is and the role it plays in our decision making. So that's one level that we'll dig into in just a moment. But the other piece is like, so how do we deconstruct our bias? Deconstruct the thing that is hidden and is held by internal assumptions and often contradictions. This is why people get uncomfortable. It makes sense. Our brains are like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. We're one race, but we're dividing people by races. It doesn't make sense that we talk about this being a land of opportunity and meritocracy playing in when we've literally founded this country on principles that did not extend to all human beings who were living in this land, including those who were the original occupants of this land. We know that cognitive dissonance doesn't jive with our thinking. And what we do with that cognitive dissonance is what results in how we show up in spaces, right? For those of us who are willing to explore it, to sit in the discomfort of it, to embrace that discomfort as part of our learning journey. For those of us who are willing to sit in the pain of that, because I come from kidnapped and enslaved Africans, I come from a history of boarding schools, I come from family members having been hunted by the Third Reich. It's a miracle that I'm here today. It is a miracle. And as I think about all of the sacrifices of my ancestors and all of the barriers that were there, I'm like, there's got to be more to my liberation coming from that history than trying to uphold something that I know wasn't built for me. I know there's more here. So that cognitive dissonance, like it prompts my curiosity. Ever since I was a little kid, I was so curious about my identity because I wanted to know, because kids see things. I wanted to know, how come I'm seeing people interact with some of my family members who look this way in this regard, but they're interacting with my other family members who look this way in a totally different way. And let me be really clear. My white family members, I watched experience power and privilege in explicit and implicit ways, while my Black and Native relatives did not have access to some of that, sometimes basic decency, sometimes basic respect, let alone safety and the expectation of safety in public spaces. That was simply not something I observed when I was with those family members that I did observe when I was with other family members. And so that cognitive dissonance prompted me to want to understand why. However, there are a lot of people who see that and they want to jump into what can I do about it? This is wrong. I don't want to be part of perpetuating this system. How do I work against those power structures? And they don't actually pause to say, but let me understand the context of where all of this came from. Let me understand the history and where my family's narrative fits into that history. We jump from stopping to be overwhelmed or shocked by these injustices, and we jump into action. There's a whole lot of thinking that we need to do. And because we do need to act, we can't spend all of our time in this linear way, thinking, understanding, and never taking meaningful steps to removing those barriers, because people's lives are at stake. So the whole purpose of understanding what it means to dig into the biases that we hold, the whole purpose of that is to start to, one, expose these hidden internal assumptions. Why do we rank humanity? Why is that something that enables us to feel really good about ourselves when we do donate our time, when we do donate our money, when we do donate our services, or if we're not donating them, we're working really, really hard, right? Like teachers, hardest working people in America. And when we're so busy fighting the system, trying to gain access because our intentions are so pure, we don't hold time to think and say, hey, what am I doing in this system? And are there instances when I actually perpetuate that system of oppression as opposed to disrupting it? And how can I change those behaviors? If we're not pausing to ask ourselves, well, what are those assumptions? What are those expectations of me as someone who is in this institution, working for this institution? If we're not actively seeking out the contradictions and wrestling with them, then I would argue we're not going to get to that liberated place. We are not going to find common ground through which we can move work forward. And we will continue to do the bare minimum to just stop the hemorrhaging, because that's real. We have to, there is such injustice in the world that there are very real needs, tangible needs, material needs. We want to address them. But at the same time, if we're constantly addressing symptoms, when do we finally get to the root cause to stop the hemorrhaging at the source? And who and what are we losing along the way? We are losing human beings, and we are losing the integrity of the ideals for which this nation was founded. I say ideals because, again, I am descendant of those who were excluded. And yet there's something in me that still clings to a little bit of hope that I can be part of changing that narrative, of moving work forward in a different way so that we could be worthy, this nation could be worthy of those ideals. So when we're talking about deconstructing bias with an intersectional lens, we're dealing with a lot of things that we're holding in our brains. It's work. It's not easy. It is easier to maintain the status quo than it is to disrupt it. You know that if you've been navigating spaces where you've hit barrier after barrier and you just get tired sometimes, whether you're volunteering or you're working in education or government, we know how that feels. It is easier to say, oh, this is just the way it is. But I would argue that this is just the way it is, or it's always been done this way, are some of the most dangerous sentences we could say when we are seeking to make positive change in the world. And so I wanted to take a few minutes to just expose you to a couple of images and actually give us some practice. And we don't necessarily, you don't need to do this for all of the images that we're going to go through, but I want you to hold them because some of these images will speak to you. You'll immediately recognize the context. You'll immediately feel things happening in your body and react to them. And I just want you to hold that and pause and engage with that. And I'm going to show a variety of images so that the diverse group of people on the call can get exposed to a couple of different images. But the idea is for you to hold, as you're looking at the image, what's coming up for you? What do you assume to be true? What have you been socialized to feel? What are the values that are coming up for you as you're looking at these images and thinking about what are the biased opinions that I might be holding, that I might have been taught or internalized in an often subliminal way without consent. Many of us have been socialized at such a young age to certain behaviors. We weren't yet at the age where we could say, I disagree with that. I don't want, tell me more. It happens very young. So I want us to be thinking about that and to hold this notion of intersectionality, of the power and privilege that we hold, as well as the marginalized aspects of our identities. And how might we leverage who we are to think differently about what might we be socialized to assume as certain images come up. So the first one is a quote. I'll elevate the quote. I want you to understand why I won't extract any part of my identity to fit into any all-inclusive idea of solidarity. I'm gonna say that again. I want you to understand why I won't extract any part of my identity to fit into any all-inclusive idea of solidarity. Now, normally when we talk about solidarity, this is the work that we do is solidarity work. Whether we're educators, whether we are working in nonprofit, whether we're volunteers, we're trying to build bridges. That's one of my core values, building bridges for purposes of solidarity. And yet, when solidarity requires us to extract pieces of our identities, it's not in the service of full liberation. So I want you to pause and think about your relationship to some of the words on this slide. First of all, who's the you? What aspects of your identity have you had to extract or felt like you couldn't fully bring into a space? And were there instances where that was appropriate, where you actually stepped back a little bit because of that unearned privilege, because of that identity? And have there been times where the inclusiveness of solidarity, which is a wonderful aspiration, have actually forced you to silence or leave a piece of your identity at the door, or unable to articulate your full and authentic self? How did that feel? How did it inhibit your ability to access your talents, your passions, your strengths in the effort when you felt like you couldn't fully show up? Take a look at another image. Show up people as one thing, only one, over and over again, and that is what they become. How many times in our efforts to do good, how many times do we sometimes oversimplify the very communities and efforts that we are trying to support because we've reduced the very people that we are working with to one thing, to the recipients of our good nature, the recipients of our positive intentions. How do we know when this has happened? Are we training ourselves to be aware of when this shows up? Are we digging into our own understanding of where we get the messages about other people and how we end up reducing their complex and nuanced humanity to one thing? And what is that narrative? How are we challenging it in our own work and practices? This is the LGBTQ flag inclusive of the black and brown stripes, which actually there are many updates to this inclusive of the trans flag. But for a long time, the controversy of adding the 2 bars at the top, and I recognize it blends a little bit with the image, apology, with the background of the slide. But there was a lot of controversy around, well, wait, we shouldn't include black and brown because it's just about queer inclusivity. This speaks to that very first question on that first slide of the expectation to leave a part of my identity. I've actually been in spaces where people say, can we just leave race and other stuff out the door so that we can be queer in this space together? Well, if one's queerness is also in relationship to their blackness, to their brownness, and they're experiencing the world in a particular way, then that's going to shift their priorities. For a long time, I was in some queer organizing spaces where people were saying the #1 issue for LGBTQ people is marriage equality. Overwhelmingly, those folks were white men and white women, cisgendered white men, cisgendered white women, who absolutely wanted to have the legal right to spend their life with the person that they choose and love and have their property and other decisions, medical and otherwise, protected. And all of the black and brown folks, the undocumented folks, the trans folks that I was organizing with were like, that's actually not our #1 issue because we're being targeted, our lives are in danger. And that is, you know, what do dead people need with a wedding license and the right to marry? And that was the question I was being asked. And so again, how are we socialized to, even in marginalized spaces, privilege the most dominant identities and perspectives? Here's another example of LGBTQ inclusion and thinking about Black Lives Matter in the context of LGBTQ spaces. Again, how are we socialized to respond to this? What might come up for you as you're looking at this? I mentioned earlier that I identify as a womanist. Some people may not be familiar with what womanism is. I would strongly encourage you to check it out. However, I would say on a baseline, Alice Walker coined the term through this phase of womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender, because she acknowledged that multiple waves of feminism was very much geared toward the interests and the priorities, politically and otherwise, of white, middle-class, college-educated women. And that does not feel inclusive of Native and Indigenous groups, of Black women, of Chicano organizers, of trans women. And so womanism is a more expansive and a more inclusive approach to ensuring that womanism, that feminist principles are truly inclusive of all women. Similarly, not all women have been assigned female at birth, and thinking about the inclusion of trans women in feminist movements or womanist movements. Also thinking about disabled women, women of color, poor women, women with disabilities, fat women. We are often geared to, oh, that's rude. And yet, when we think about who's taking up spaces, how are spaces inclusive of all bodies? These are things that we have to be willing to name and boldly. The positioning of different minority groups against others in order to further maintain a racial hierarchy in this country without the consent of those groups. And so this model minority myth for Asian Americans and Asian people, a huge, diverse, nuanced community that's just lumped arbitrarily together, despite being, I think, over 2 billion people making up this group that is Asian across the globe, and positioning some people to have a little bit more as a tool, in this instance, this model minority myth, as a tool of anti-Blackness that emerged in the 1960s when there was a second wave of Asian immigration that was overwhelmingly an educated middle-class wave of individuals. And at a time when people were galvanizing around phrases like Black is beautiful, Black power, using this group, taking certain aspects of their identity out of context and arguing this is a group that came to this country, was able to get their stuff together. How come Black Americans have been here for hundreds of years can't do the same? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, politically, historically, in terms of our legislation that would block that advancement. And so when we are seeing marginalized groups pitted against each other, and we are not seeking out that solidarity work, we are socialized to say my issues, my family, my stuff is more important than the shared or the collective. And it's really critical that when we are breaking down our understanding of what intersectional identities are, and when we're working across many lines of difference in our work, that we are thinking, have any of these groups been socialized to be pitted against each other? Are our shared values, are our political aims, is our agenda here aligned? And when we can deconstruct assumptions about what people want and our role in that and our support, we can better understand how to build solidarity movements that, per that first quote, do not require that people take a piece of who they are and leave it at the door when they're coming into these spaces.
Courtney, excuse me. We have a question, and I wasn't sure if you wanted to answer them as you go or ask people to hold them until the end. I apologize for that.
We can go ahead and take them. No, that's fine. I have a few more images, so I'm just going to cycle through, and I would encourage people to continue to look at them. But if folks have questions, feel free to just come off mute, because I can't really see the chat very well. I could pull it over, I guess.
So I can see that Dina Robinson has her hand raised. Dina, do you want to unmute and ask Courtney your question?
Sorry, that was a mistake. I hit the button by mistake.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't see any other hands, so if there are no other questions, I apologize for the interruption, Courtney. I just wanted to make sure we were respecting your process.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. So let's talk about this image, because I alluded to this image earlier. So this is a group of people who are white. I would assume they're racialized as white. And I'm going to make the assumption that they are living at or below the poverty line. And so there are people in this picture who racially have been positioned to have the best outcomes in major institutions. And yet, I would argue that there are individuals in this picture who likely are not having all of their needs met, as indicated by what I can see as instances of poverty. And so this is an example of when we need to think about the intersecting aspects of our identity. Yes, these individuals are white, and the assumption and context of this picture, with me knowing a little bit more about it, is that they are also living below the poverty line. And when we have such a stark two things that are working so close together, race and class, and there's a disruption of what the assumption should be, that's where we start to experience tensions of like, well, I'm not having my needs met, I'm working really hard. And there's often a comparison of, for example, poor white people to, for example, middle-class Black people. But what if we take that comparison and actually match it across all of the labels? What are the outcomes and opportunities for poor white people as compared to poor Black people in this country? Because even as you start to just compare across the economic the income base, you're going to see that for most white families, they are still within 1 to 2 generations of being lifted out of poverty, while the wealth gap between both poor whites, middle-class whites, and affluent whites when compared to Black families is significant. It's, I think the average white family at this point has, I want to say 14 times the wealth as the average Black family. And so that gets bigger as you move from people who are working class into middle class, into upper middle class, into affluent, but there's still that gap. And we have to be thinking about, well, what is that about? And nobody asked to be Black, nobody asked to be white. This is racial assignment, because there is one human race. The mapping of the Human Genome Project demonstrated that. And so when we're talking about indicators such as phenotype, hair texture, skin color, things that are not consistent, most people do not read me as Black as I navigate spaces. So it's not always reliable, but these indicators are what position us to build in a story and to fill in gaps. And those gaps, even in small ways, are still positioned to advantage some at the expense of others. And that's something that we need to be thinking about when confronted with it. A few more images pertaining to disability. At the end of the day, I think human beings want to be seen. And as we are doing the work that we're doing, as we're navigating spaces, as we're trying to do, because our intentions are in the right place, as we're trying to do the right thing, I think we still need to bring that critical lens to say, are people being seen? Are we acknowledging that we're not just talking about individuals, but a collective, whole communities? And are we listening to the needs of those individuals, whether we are setting up exhibits in a museum? What narratives are we telling? Whether we are doing volunteer work to address the fallout of a natural disaster, whether we are organizing and putting forth efforts around policies, around voting rights, around other things related to legislation. We have to be thinking about, historically, where have I individually been positioned to have power here? Are there systems that have a vested interest in us not building solidarity movements? And are our solidarity movements themselves requiring people to leave pieces of who they are at the door? So when we think about analyzing a conceptual system, such as democracy, such as racism, such as volunteerism, how are we actively looking at the hidden internal assumptions and contradictions and subverting it of its apparent significance or unity? That word apparent is relevant. Sometimes we are apparently unified when in actuality we need to break it down. Are all people involved in this work having their needs met? And are we doing everything we possibly can to look at whole groups whose needs have historically and contemporarily not been met at some of the highest rates? Are we privileging their experiences in the work that we're trying to do? Are they even at the table? Are we having conversations with them? Are they included in this work? So this is actually a critique of intersectionality, and I want to give people a chance to engage with this, and then we're going to open it up for some questions because I know we're getting pretty close to time. Some people would argue that if we just keep adding more and more and more and more, our banners are too big, there are too many people to keep track of, we can't possibly solve all of the issues and all of the spheres in which oppression is existing. And yet I would argue, why not? Instead of trying to figure out how many issues and people to put on the signs, what if we just made bigger signs? What if we just assumed that if we address the issues of those who are most marginalized, other people will benefit from that? And so while I do appreciate the, well, what about, I actually take that retort, because I don't often think it's offered genuinely, and I turn it into an actual question that I think we should engage with. Well, what do you need in this? Historically, what has your experience been? What is your family's narrative? Let's have a conversation about that, because there is a place for you in this work. We need you in this work. We want you in this work. We're not always going to like each other in this work, and that's okay. But we have to be willing to move the work forward. And if we're leaving any human being out of this equation, then it is not an inclusive movement. It will not lead to the liberation of all people. And even if you disagree with something about someone's lifestyle or what they're doing or their political beliefs, we have to remember that at any given time, no one's humanity can be off the table, because then it's a threat to all of our humanity. I'll close with a few words around this concept of intersectionality. It's not a buzzword, it's not a catchphrase. For some of us, it is our life, and we need people to take it seriously. Even as we're doing really hard work from our heart, we have to think about the impact of intersectionality. Intersectionality is about advantage and marginalization together. It's about individual, but also interpersonal and institutional power in the context of a larger system, and it is simultaneous. What it isn't is compartmentalized. It's not playing the oppression Olympics, and it's not new. When Sojourner Truth bore her breath and said, "Ain't I a woman?" she was saying, I too am in this. Couple questions to consider. What are the problems that you seek to solve? And what problems do we seek to solve together? And how can you leverage deconstructing bias and the bias we are socialized to have with that intersectional lens? How can we bring all of the pieces of who we are and the narratives of the people that we don't know? Which means we probably need to get into proximity with some people we don't know and that we aren't spending enough time with. So I'll close on that note. Thank you so much for having me. And if we do have time for a couple of questions, if there are questions, I'm more than happy to hold that space.
Wow, thank you so much, Courtney. And it's just Albert, not Mr. Irvin. That's my dad, by the way. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I got some gems from things you said today and some of the community work that I'm doing at home in Rocky Mount, as well as some ideas that I might be able to apply to, our volunteer work, and in particular our volunteer program, and how we structure the program that we do to be aware of our own biases and our power, as you said, as gatekeepers. And thank you for what you said about that, because I often think of being a gatekeeper as a negative thing, and you put it in a positive light, and that's going to help me, I think, in the work going forward. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for the stop, think, and then act. And sometimes for some of us, we can get caught up in that too much thinking before we go into action. And so we got to remember not to get stalled in that spot, right? And that action does have to happen, but we do have to have the thinking before we just jump into action. So thank you for that. So anyway, those are just some gems that I personally got, and I really appreciate your perspective and what you shared today. But I think we do have time for some other questions. Is there anyone in the chat? Oh, I see some thank yous, but let's see if there's some questions. And Caroline, if you help me too, because let's see. I see. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Inspiring, great presentation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Very informative. Thank you. I'll be digesting for days. I think that's true for me as well. And wonderful presentation. Did I miss any questions?
Did not see any other questions.
Well, Courtney, and thank you also for allowing us to record this, because I think anyone who could not be with us today in person live, there's going to be value in what you shared with us and sharing with other folks going forward as well. Oh, and you're muted.
Thank you. And I just want to name all the gratitude I have for the important work that you all are doing. We all have a role to play in constructing this world that none of us have ever seen. A liberated world is something none of us has ever seen, and there is great sacrifice and great intentionality that goes into it. So thank you for all of the work that everyone who is in this space is doing today, and I hope that the day is full of lots of life-giving energy and very tangible outcomes and things that you can apply to the work that you do, because it is so needed.
All right, well, thank you. All right, well, if there are no other questions, then Courtney, thank you. And you're welcome to be with us throughout the day and to pick any session you want to go to. Or again, they'll also be recorded for your perusal later. But we're so grateful to have you today. Thank you.
Yes. And